of a Pestilence, SCP-049, an SCP Tale by John Hudson, based on the original concept by Gabriel, Jade and Djkaktus, licensed under CC BY SA. Ascendant Ischolopius. Learning how to wait is the initiatory experience in the career of every physician. During my apprenticeship to patients as a novitiate in medicine, time passed slowly, and I applied myself assiduously to the study of complicated diseases, which will occur perhaps once, if at all, in the professional life of a busy physician. The ordinary diseases, like dyspepsia, bronchitis, colic, and even toothache, were dismissed without even a moiety of attention. Much to my sorrow, I soon learned that only the rich and influential physician could afford to diagnose an obscure disease and call it by its technical term. If an unknown physician diagnoses a case of toothache, he tells the sufferer it is a toothache, but the opulent consultant is privileged to call it odontalgia, and regulates his honorarium accordingly. One day when the gastric vacuum was becoming pronounced, and when the coloration of my feelings was assuming a cerulean aspect, Mrs. Hannah Jade, one of my neighbors, entered the waiting room of my office. I saw Mrs. Jade through the keyhole. I was so perturbed that I hardly knew what to do. This was evidently to be my first patient. I didn't want to lose her, nor did I deem it proper to admit her at once into my consultation room. I coughed loudly to assure her that I was in, and then I walked stealthily around to the door of the waiting room, locking it from the outside, to be sure that Mrs. Jade would not escape. Then I hurriedly rearranged my room, taking from the bookcase some ponderous volumes, and distributing them carelessly about my writing desk. I gathered up all the loose leaves of papyrus, and I gave special prominence to a skull. It had done duty in life for over 20 years, contributing food to a friend of mine, and had died from a condition of the heart, as a confirmed gourmand. I coughed again, and then, as if talking loudly to a supposititious patient, I grandiloquently announced, "My dear sir, I thank you for the $1,000 for saving the young Duke's life. Should my services be required again, call on me. Don't thank me again, my dear sir, the dollars are genuine sincerity. Good day to you, sir." Having delivered myself of these words, with only the last 50 cents in my pocket, I peeped through the keyhole to note the effect of my language upon Mrs. Jade. She was pacing the room nervously, in evident distress. She must be suffering from some nervous trouble, I thought. I looked through an index of symptoms very hurriedly, and found that nervous walking was indicative of several nervous diseases. I opened the door and admitted Mrs. Jade. "Please," said, "excuse me for keeping you waiting, Mrs. Jade. The fact is I was very busy." I pulled a chair out for her perch with graciousness. "You seem to be suffering from a nervous affection, Mrs. Jade. Your eyes bear the markings of distress ache. Your pulse is somewhat agitated. Surely it's not me at all that is sick, doctor. It is me own darling son, Gabe." "Oh, or little Gabe is sick?" I queried. "What ails him? Surely it's for you to find out. If I knew, would I be coming to you then?" Mrs. Jade procured a handkerchief from her purse and tended to the edges of her eyes as I did my best to patiently look on, fastidious and attentive, rebelling against the entire span of my attention, fixating on the rag she used as being a catalyst for disease. "Gabe has swallowed something down his sarcophagus, or so the other doctor said, and it is this very devil that be playing with his lights ever since." "There were other physicians you sought before myself?" I asked incredulously. I pondered that perhaps my neighbor Mrs. Jade was clever enough to play upon my pride, as she relayed to me the futility of their prognosis, and assured me of their ineptitudes. She said, "Them doctors are no longer in attendance. They've given me Gabe up," and here she wept, bitterly. I told them was not a cold, doctor. It'd be an illumination of his lights. I remembered Gabe very well. A dirty, freckled little rascal with red hair. Oftentimes, in the bitterness of my heart, when I had cursed my fate, and sought solace in walking around the neighborhood, I would encounter him. He was a saucy imp, generous to a fault, and the pride of the neighborhood. Everybody liked Gabe, as did I. "Mrs. Jade, I will absolutely attend to poor Gabe," I said with as much a look of sympathy as I could wager to expend upon her. "I must attend a function tonight. It is a rare occasion indeed. Perhaps I could stop by your humble abode this evening?" After my function, Mrs. Jade thanked me profusely. I instructed her to see the receptionist in the waiting area for my bill of consultation. However, the young receptionist was about as far as my invoice got. Its presentation brought forth a rejoinder from Mrs. Jade that she had heard a wealthy patient just pay me $1,000, and surely a physician with that kind of money ought not to trouble a poor widow. She was right, of course. God is the paymaster of the poor and diseased, and he must dearly love them, for he makes so many of them. Clever was I, and so much devoted to my craft, that rarely did I indulge in social functions, and had made it to the age of 37 without taking a wife. Tonight, however, cast upon me a particular lore in the form of one Lady Emma Katz, only daughter to Djkaktus Katz, the capitalist. Our introduction was to be through that of a mutual acquaintance, and we had never met before that night. Donning a dusty, antiquated tuxedo, possibly the only thing of value left from my late father's shambled estate, I nervously handed the help my overcoat and entered the gathering. I was immediately offered a flute of sparkling beverage, and while I did not partake of the drink, myself, I found a sort of comfort in simply holding it, as if proof of my social participation. Well, look what the cat dragged in, came a familiar voice from the room adjacent to where I had entered. The voice belonged to one Dr. Edmund Lady, a colleague and former classmate in medical school. I had hated him from the moment we met, and he often spared no cost to sharpen the claws of his social status upon the scratching post at my expense. Don't blame me, said Mr. Katz, standing next to him. I didn't invite him. My daughter's derelict friend did. The other esteemed gentleman standing with them I did not. No. Supposedly the invitation was to the ends of an introduction with your daughter, Mr. Katz, I said, gracing the party with what I had hoped would be a charming smile. The other two blushed, and while Mr. Katz similarly turned red, his flushing was most likely a culprit of anger rather than timidness. He finished off his flute in one large gulp, and I couldn't imagine why she'd think that an idea worth merit. His gaze seethed with such a rage that I almost imagine him foaming at the mouth in my recollections. I then turned my attention back to Dr. Lady. Edmund, I hear you've devoted your practice exclusively towards heart conditions? Yes, he said, humoring my conversation and company, but if only to flaunt his own accomplishments. A peculiar muscle with which we know harrowingly little. Well, I said, sipping the flute of champagne, wincing at its foul taste. A peculiar muscle certainly deserves a peculiar doctor with such a peculiar focus on it. Oh ho, he parried. And what fascinating cases has your humble practice taken on? Why, this very evening I will be visiting the home of the widow Mrs. Jade. Seems her son Gabe has an ailment other doctors could not remedy, so she sought out my expertise. Dr. Lady let out a laugh which almost choked him on his mouthful of drink. Yes, yes. Mrs. Jade, he said, wiping his chin. Why, I ran her out of my office just yesterday. Hear me, doctor, he said as if to flay the skin from off of my neck and borrow his condescending enunciation beneath it. That boy Gabe has a common cold. No more. No less. And good luck collecting the bill. The three excused themselves from my presence, feigning some sort of social obligation. After a brief, albeit awkward round through the various persons in attendance, I made my way upstairs, and to the balcony overlooking the Katz estate. I spied upon Mr. Katz's daughter's friend, entertaining for herself a small host of available suitors, but saw nothing of a female accomplice who might be the Emma Katz with whom I had endured the merriment to meet. Any stars out tonight? A soft voice came from behind me, interrupting the chirping of crickets in the night air. Feels better out here than in there. I turned to face the disembodied voice, and my eyes fell upon the most beautiful visage. Her pale, supple features glistened just as magnanimously under the moon as did the sequins tethered to her gown. Oh, there are always stars, madam. Even if they shy behind emboldened clouds, they can only hide for so long. The young lady gave a smile and slight chuckle just as a grand crack of thunder in the distance announced itself upon the night. Much like us. Hiding from these dreadful gatherings upon a balcony? My body tensed, and suddenly it occurred to me that I lacked the social lexicon with which to engage. Hiding. I am not Emma Katz, she smiled, holding her precious, dainty hand out in greeting. You must be the doctor our mutual friend Elizabeth told me about. That I am, I said, reaching as deeply into myself as I could to find a renewed confidence. I accepted her hand, but with my other held her wrist. An unusual handshake you have there, sir. Just wanted to see something. Our eyes met for what seemed would have been briefly, but then locked onto something of an attraction which did not want to let go. In a sudden loss of balance, she tore her hand away from mine to grab upon the railing of the balcony. Miss Katz, are you okay? I asked, now a doctor once more, and concerned for her health. I held her by her underarm acting as a crutch. Just a bit too much champagne I'm sure, she said trying to laugh away her folly. I held my hand to her head. Miss Katz, you do appear to have struck a slight fever. I haven't my Gladstone with me, but perhaps we should procure a carriage to my office? She gave a brief glance back at the party, then again to me. After you, doctor. I still strained to recall the events leading me to where I now stood, soaked to the bone from the torrential downpour that had beset upon the night sky. The rain did hitherto little to rid my hands, and ruined vestments of the blood, which had dried and congealed into skin and fabric alike. I stood this way for some immeasurable passage of time, and know not why. Perhaps the rain soothed me, in this trying moment? I reached for the front door's knocker, giving it 3 loud thuds. Examining my hand as I pulled away, I noticed my shaking had subsided. The door swung open, and in its threshold stood Mrs. Jade. I could tell she had meant to greet me with courtesy in that moment, but it soon faded into equal parts horror and confusion upon seeing me in my current state. Soaking wet, covered in blood. "Doctor," the boy said sternly. "Take me to him, Mrs. Jade." She hesitantly ushered me in. Little Gabe must have been propped with every pillow the house had held. He had dismissed the heavier blankets down to the foot of his bed in favor of a single, thin sheet. His red hair was laid flat and damp upon his scalp, and his forehead glistened with a constantly running sheen of perspiration. I, at first, assumed him to be sleeping, however a vibrant fit of coughing and wheezing proved otherwise. I knelt down at his bedside, retrieving a stethoscope from my Gladstone, and placed it upon his chest. His heart beat with an occasional irregularity. I lifted the scamp up, and placed my ear to his back. His lungs wheezed and labored with each breath. As I laid him back onto the pillows, I noticed a small protrusion beneath his chest. A lump, as if were a solid, foreign object wedged into the cavity. I motioned for Mrs. J to bring me the only candle illuminating the dark room. Retrieving the scalpel from my bag, I held its blade over the flame for a few moments, and then proceeded to make the lightest, steadiest of incisions on the welt. The boy groaned. When I had seen that no pus ran from it, I pressed the still hot side of my scalpel against the incision, sealing it. I placed my instruments back into the Gladstone. "Well, doctor? Do you see? The devil be talking me, boy." I sank upon my knees, and let my head fall down. "It's not the devil, Mrs. Jade. Not God, not the devil. Little Gabe has a low fever, and a common cold." A part of myself surrendered defeat in that moment, but just as I was about to gather my tools, I looked back towards the lump on his chest. "It's not God," I said firmly, as I slammed my fist down onto the lump. Gabe was unresponsive at this point. "It's not the devil." I slammed my fist down onto Gabe's chest again. "None of it means anything," I exclaimed in frustration, each time delivering an abusive blow to the poor boy's protuberance. After the 5th successive hit, Gabe spasmed to life, flailing his arms and legs out as far as his little frame would extend, if not more, as his joints gave dull popping noises as they released from their respective sockets. The lump upon his chest moved upwards, trailing back up his esophagus towards his mouth. His eyes opened, but these were no human eyes. They were illuminated like the sun, shining brightly into the dimness of the room. I fell back onto my rump in awe, as the thing moving in his chest slowly raised out of his mouth and into the air above his head. It was a perfectly spherical orb of light, filling the room with hues of blue, and irregular violent flashes of a preternatural shade of violet.
"Ori Akmaris,"
spake a voice out of Gabe's, from within the boy, using the poor child as a mouth for its ancient dialect, which I failed at the time to recognize or understand. Gabe's head turned towards me, but not as if he had turned it. His head turned without the next permission, with terrible crackling and popping noises accompanying the motion. It smiled.
"Alka ki Trobu, Doctor."
I was petrified upon the floor, frozen with something like awe and terror. "Sweet Jesus, Mary, Joseph." Mrs. Jade shrieked as she fervently signed the cross.
"Ilu me too."
Gabe's finger contorted its joints until it pointed towards me, and then further contorted, motioning up at the orb. A storm had set upon us during our journey to my office, which was dark upon our arrival. The receptionist had long since finished her duties, and locked up to go home for the evening. However, upon attempting to illuminate the electric lights, I found their switches unresponsive. I lit a couple of old lanterns which were stashed away that the previous tenant had abandoned with the space. "Seems the storm has knocked the power out," I said while reaching for some tinctures I had pre-made the day before. "How are you feeling?" "Better. Honestly, I think I had just drank too much. I just wanted to get away from that party. I've never been one for such fanciful functions." "Nor I concurred with a chuckle. "Your friend Elizabeth was absolutely adamant that we should meet." And what?" I inquired. "Are you glad you came? Glad we met?" "Yes. At least as much as you are. I won't deny I find you very attractive, just as I am sure you do." "What makes you assume I find you attractive?" I took Emma's hand, just as I had done when we greeted each other at the party, with my left hand holding her wrist. My peculiar handshake was no handshake at all, Emma. I was taking your pulse. Your heart betrays you. I smiled as warmly as I could. She blushed, and gently pulled her hand away, looking down. "Well, I said, clearing my throat. "Drink this vial, all at once, and you should feel better. Perhaps tomorrow you can come back, and I can draw some blood for testing." Emma stood up, and began to wander my quarters. Her eyes found, on a shelf, an old plague mask which I had purchased years ago as a trinket. "What wild thing is this?" she asked. "An old doctor's mask. Used during the Black Plague to protect the doctors from the infected." I further explained, "My great-great-great-grandfather fancied that he had perfected the design, of which you now hold in your hands. I like it." She smiled, but her smile crept its way towards the corners of her mouth that indicated a shift more towards a mischievous grin, and she pulled the mask over her head, striking a glamorous pose as if having just finished up in a powder room. How do I look? Perhaps it was the way she had elicited a laugh from me, or perhaps in that moment I felt particularly bold, but whatever the cause, I walked over to Emma, and slowly lifted the mask from her face, setting it within my Gladstone next to her. "Beautiful," I whispered, as I leaned in to kiss her. At this most pulchritudinous moment between us, a loud crash from the waiting area gave way to the door of my consultation chambers being unceremoniously kicked in, the whole slab being torn from its hinges. "You unscrupulousness charlatan." Djkaktus stumbled in through the half-hung door, his drunkenness exceedingly apparent. He took a long draw from his flask until it was spent, and threw it to the ground, laboring to prime his hunting rifle's dual hammers. "Father," yelled Emma, "you come into my house unannounced, drink my booze, and steal away into the night with my daughter, you peasant? You fraud?" "Djkaktus," I said, raising my hands as he raised the rifle to me. "I can assure you that my intentions are pure. You are very drunk, sir. Perhaps you should. You're a dead man." The next moments blur slightly in my hindsight, and sadly I am left without much recollection. Somehow, from the deafening discharge of the rifle, to holding Emma in my arms, desperately trying to hold the blood inside of her which poured out from the gaping hole in her abdomen, I became overrun with tears. "Look what you did!" Djkaktus yelled, rather, tried to yell. His accusations barely formed from his lips, simply whispering their way out as wisps between heavy breaths. "You'll burn for this." "What I did?" I cried. "What I did?" I laid Emma's body back to the floor, and reached upon my desk for the skull I kept. Grabbing it, I walked over to Djkaktus and utilized it to crush his own. His and his daughter's blood mixed upon me, covering me in macabre splatters and fragments of bone. Again and again I struck his face, until his soul had departed from this plane, myself ensuring it took the totality of his features with it, his head now completely concave. I sat weeping for some time, in the dim confines of my office-made crime scene. I was empty, as dead inside as the two cats in my quarters. Not knowing what else to do, I grabbed my Gladstone, and proceeded out into the storm. I noticed, still in my bag, was the plague mask I had taken off of Emma. I picked it up and held it to my nose. Her perfume was still upon it. The orb began to expand until it swallowed the possessed little Gabe wholly, as well as the bed upon which he lay. I put the mask on, and walked into the light of the orb. It was in this moment which I peered into and through the luminescence of the orb, seeing within it something like that which was before the beginning of time, a singularity. All things, all souls, all eons homogeneous, but before they ever were. Like that of an elusive particle, a field, thrust suddenly upon runaway expansion at the intersection of some great, heavenly force, only to collapse back again into a new orbit about its center. This was the universe before becoming. This was the primordial particle. A philosopher's stone of everything. At its widest point of bulbous distension, within its milky ether, I spied a queer interaction. A fault line of deviation from the norm of its fluctuations, tearing and refilling the fabric comprising its own sinew, compelling its growth further than was meant to ever go. An infection. A disease, and wretched mutation, a pestilence. Hearken to I was the realization that within my consciousness there was a mask which shielded me from the plague of ignorance. As a physician's tools of incision and discovery are often the same tools with which is procured recovery, so long as I had the wit and wherewithal of my own imagination to guide me, not only was I immune to the pestilence itself, but also could I cure it. This orb was our world, and our world was sick. The universe had lifted her skirt and shown me the affliction, divulged her dirty, little secret. She was ill. And I was. And I am.
A doctor.
Hey guys, this is John here with Forgotten Tales. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please consider hitting the subscribe button. That's what allows me to keep doing this and keep making videos for you. And let me know in the comments if there's a particular SCP you want to see woven into a tale. Thanks again, guys. Love you. Be blessed.